Last week, Nintendo surprised us with 15 Game Boy and Game Boy Advance games for their Nintendo Switch Online subscription service. Not to be outdone, Sony countered this week with a trio of 32-bit role-playing games. Okay, maybe that's not as impressive as 15 games, but what this update lacks in quantity, it more than makes up for in length. This month, we're getting Wild Arms 2, Harvest Moon Back to Nature, and The Legend of Dragoon. These are 3 long games, but are any of them actually worth playing? To answer that question, I decided to flip through the pages of Electronic Gaming Monthly, Incite Video Gaming, Next Generation, and more classic magazines to see what the critics said back when these games first came out. Grab your favorite longsword and prepare to do some gardening, because this is another polarizing episode of the PS Plus Review Crew.
More on that top story at 11. And in local news, while cleaning up an abandoned lot on the corner of 3rd and Washington, a group of high school students stumbled upon a major archaeological find. It appears the kids from Killian High discovered the remains of a family of woolly mammoths. The surprised students said it looks like they're not sure going to get a better cleaning now. Archaeologists hope the well-preserved bones will shed new light on the PlayStation.
In a month filled with titles like Wild Arms 2 and The Legend of Dragoon, you might be tempted to describe this month's 32-bit lineup as nothing but a bunch of role-playing games. But that would be a great disservice to Harvest Moon Back in Nature, a game that is more farm simulator than Final Fantasy. Although it may seem niche, this PlayStation sequel, and the entire franchise if I'm being honest, is incredibly accessible to everybody, full of charming characters and surprisingly fun missions. And if you've never played a Harvest Moon game before, then Back in Nature is a great place to start. Let's see what the critics had to say. Gary from Electronic Gaming Monthly would probably disagree with my description of this 32-bit Harvest Moon sequel. Giving it a 7 out of 10, he makes the case that this game is not just a farming sim, but a whole life simulator. You won't just be working the land, you'll need to find time to chat up the ladies, manage your resources, develop your property, and glad hand your neighbors, all in an effort to prove that you've got what it takes to be the rightful owner of your family farm. Having to do certain chores every day can become a drag by the end of the season, and the complete lack of fancy pyrotechnics limits its appeal. That 7 that Harvest Moon got from EGM is right in line with what the rest of the critics were saying at the time. It perfectly lines up with the 3.5 out of 5 that we saw from the official US PlayStation magazine in issue 40, as well as the 7 out of 10 score that came from PlayStation, the official magazine. Well, not exactly the game of choice for survival horror fans or first-person shooter fiends, this is one series that is guaranteed to keep on giving if you're a sucker for sims and niche titles. Now, in case you're wondering, the lowest score came from Game Informer, who gave Harvest Moon a 6.75 out of 10. In contrast, the highest score came from GamePro, who gave it a 4 out of 5. Lest you think the game is outright boring, however, there are quite a few ways to break the monotony. Your character interacts with the nearby village, runs errands, does favors, and generally chats the day away. If you work fast enough, your character could even marry one of the available maidens. In the end, Harvest Moon is not the game for the Street Fighter crowd. It requires a large time investment, but for those willing to put in the time, it can be quite rewarding. So, okay, hang on here, let me get this straight. The game is not for survival horror fans, first-person shooters, and now the Street Fighter crowd. Anybody else we're forgetting? Maybe speedsters and rhythm gamers? You know what, I suggest you download the game for yourself and see if this is the kind of game for you. When it comes to role-playing games on the PlayStation, there are the ones that came out before Final Fantasy VII, and then there are the ones that came out after Final Fantasy VII. With its more cinematic look and epic cutscenes, The Legend of Dragoon clearly came out after Final Fantasy VII. It also toyed with the combat by mixing both turn-based action and real-time commands, and even introduced a few quick-time events here and there. Unfortunately, selling just over 1 million units, the game had a hard time competing with the other high-profile role-playing games on the PlayStation, and Sony quietly cancelled the sequel while it was still in pre-production. When it came to the reviews, the critics were decidedly mixed. Some hated it, such as Incite Video Gaming, who gave it a 2 out of 5 and argued that Legend of Dragoon could have been so much more. With a staff of at least 100 people, a rumored budget of a few $1 million, and nearly 3 years in development, this release should have been exactly what it was designed to be, a Final Fantasy VII killer. Instead, we got a game that more closely resembles Shadow Madness than a Squaresoft title. When you add overall visuals not as appealing as those of the 3-year-old Final Fantasy VII, sucky music, a battle system that takes ages to get interesting, and the very linear feel to the game flow, Legend of Dragoon ends up being more a good way to waste time before Chrono Cross arrives than anything else. While Incite may have hated it, other critics loved this one-and-done RPG. Next Generation, for example, gave the game a 4 out of 5, the same score that they gave Chrono Trigger. GamePro went even higher, giving the game a perfect 5 out of 5 in their 143rd issue. The Legend of Dragoon is welcome in a genre that's more and more predictable. The powerful story of equality and tolerance, a great cast, gorgeous locations and cutscenes, and an inventive and enjoyable battle system work together to create an instant classic. And then there's Electronic Gaming Monthly, which was right in the middle, giving it a 5 out of 5 out of 10. They neither loved it nor hated it. The Legend of Dragoon was a very middle-of-the-road RPG. This is getting ridiculous. Sony is a company with a lot of money at their disposal, and they are unable to do decent English translations of RPGs. What's the deal? The lack of good, coherent writing and some badly dubbed dialogue sours what would otherwise be a great RPG experience. For me, RPGs are all about story, and if Sony isn't willing to give it the once-over and make it coherent, then why should anybody waste their time? With scores that are all over the place, The Legend of Dragoon is easily one of the most divisive PlayStation games on the PS Plus service.
Legend of Dragoon 12月2日 PlayStation
From one RPG franchise that had no sequels to one that arguably had too many, it's time to talk about Wild Arms 2. Coming 3 years after the well-received original, this sequel features brand new characters, an original plot, and some important changes to both the gameplay and the presentation. Unfortunately, they toned down the Western aesthetic, leaving us with a world inspired more by high fantasy than the Wild West. That's disappointing, but this game has a much bigger problem, and that's the expectations that critics have on RPGs after the release of Final Fantasy VII. This is a problem that plagued the game in every single review, both good and bad. In fact, Electronic Gaming Monthly addressed it right at the start. The original Wild Arms was the right game at the right time, but that time was 3 years ago, before Final Fantasy VII and the flood of gotta-have RPGs that have hit the PlayStation since. This sequel, which plays and looks much like the original, doesn't have what it takes to steal the thunder from current RPG juggernauts. Dialogue rambles and the plot gets confusing, but the dungeon and character building system are compelling enough to hold your interest. Despite some legitimate complaints, Electronic Gaming Monthly ended up giving Wild Arms 2 an average score of 7 out of 10. That's directly in line with the official US PlayStation magazine, which gave the game a 3.5 out of 5. Incite was a little bit lower on the game, but still liked it more than The Legend of Dragoon, giving it a 3 out of 5. That's the same score you saw from Next Generation, who called the game an adequate title, but one that doesn't have as much to offer as competitors such as Vagrant Story and Alundra 2. As expected, GamePro liked it more than Next Generation, giving it an impressive 4 out of 5. Of course, the highest score I could find came from, you guessed it, GameFan, who gave it a 90%. However, despite that high score, they did have one complaint that few other critics mentioned. The translation of this game varies from good to blasé to what were they thinking? You'll encounter a number of anachronisms along the way, like the booty call item, which inevitably jars you back to reality, a la Workin' Design's more wacky endeavors. They concluded by calling Wild Arms 2 a fun-filled RPG adventure that's sure to tide RPG fans over till the heavy hitters Chrono Cross, Legend of Dragoon, and Final Fantasy IX arrive later this year. With all those RPGs out now, and many more to choose from in 2023, I'm gonna let you decide whether Wild Arms 2 is worth a download.
PlayStation.
Hey, thanks for watching me talk about these PlayStation Plus games. If you liked what you saw here, then you should know that we post new episodes every single time Sony adds more original PlayStation games to their subscription service. We have a whole playlist with every single PSOne game on the PS Plus. So go ahead, give it a look if that's the thing you're interested in watching. Now, here's the question I have for you. What is your favorite era of role-playing games? Do you like the old school 8 and 16-bit stuff? Maybe the 32-bit games? The more modern RPGs, perhaps? Let me see your picks in the comments below. In other news, I'm working on a whole bunch of reviews. Look for Hitman: World of Assassination tomorrow, followed next week by Wanted Dead and Wonder Boy. While you wait for that, I strongly recommend you click that subscribe button and support what we're doing here. Until then.